Welcome, everyone. I'm Brendan Baker, Vice President of Development at RAND. Thanks for joining us for today's RAND remote conversation on election safety. As Election Day quickly approaches, I know I have a lot of questions. For me, going to a polling place and actually casting my ballot is a part of the voting experience. I love to see the parents bring their children with them to vote, demonstrating the importance of this civic duty. I also proudly wear my I voted sticker. But can any of this happen this year during the COVID-19 pandemic? Will people mail in ballots, and will those ballots be counted? Or will people opt out of voting entirely this year? I don't have these answers, but I'm grateful that I'm joined remotely by RAND researchers Jennifer Kavanagh and Quentin Hodgson. They're here to discuss these unique voting challenges and share findings from their research on how to prepare for safe elections during a pandemic. The research project is part of RAND's Countering Truth Decay initiative, which is focused on restoring the role of facts and analysis in public life. This is one of the critical priorities of our Tomorrow Demands Today fundraising campaign, and philanthropic support helped make this research that they will discuss possible. Jennifer, Quentin, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started with some questions. So Jennifer, I know the pandemic disrupted many state primaries this past spring and summer, and we continue to hear about foreign interference in our elections. How well prepared is the United States to hold its election this November?
There's a lot of variation. It's hard to talk about preparedness at the aggregate level. There are about 8,800 different jurisdictions in the United States, and each one conducts elections in a slightly different way. And that means that each one has a different level of preparedness when we're talking about both readiness to counter foreign threats, cyber threats, as well as challenges from the pandemic. And we can think about those challenges in three buckets. There are challenges related to safety. Those are specifically related to the pandemic. We can think about challenges related to integrity. That has to do with fraud, disinformation, and disenfranchisement. And we can think about challenges from security. And those are cyber threats, as well as other types of foreign influence or hacking. On the safety measure, states, again, they vary depending on how much they've invested in things like PPE for poll workers, what types of locations they're using for in-person polling. Some states are using big sports arenas, other states are using much smaller venues, how many polling locations they have open, and the voter density in those areas. Those are all factors that are going to affect preparedness for safety. On the integrity measure, the biggest challenge really is disinformation. We hear a lot about fraud, the potential fraud from mail-in voting or from in-person voting, but in reality, the risk of that type of fraud impacting the election is very low. Disinformation is a much bigger challenge. It's really hard for tech platforms to effectively counter the amount of disinformation that's out there. They've made some steps forward, but they're never going to be able to remove all of the disinformation. There are better measures or thinking about how we prepare voters to disentangle true information from false information. But that's still an area of risk that exists. And then there are also those risks related to security and cyber threats. I'm going to let Quentin talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in terms of cybersecurity risks, of course, this has been an area of focus for the federal government through the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the Elections Assistance Commission, working with the states for a number of years now, particularly going back to January 2017, when the Department of Homeland Security made elections part of critical infrastructure. And that designation really helped them mobilize their resources to help state and local governments. But as Jennifer pointed out, there's a real disparity both in terms of resources and capability across states and local jurisdictions. And so their posture right now, how well they've done in terms of identifying the risks that they have and mitigating those risks, is really uneven. And that really just comes down to people, time, and resources. And some places are very well resourced to deal with it. You think about Los Angeles County is the largest jurisdiction in the country. It has a security officer who's dedicated to just looking at their elections infrastructure. Orange County, California is similar, Fairfax County in Virginia. And then you have much smaller areas and jurisdictions where you have far fewer people, and sometimes there will be a county clerk who's responsible for not just elections, but for wills and for business certification and so forth. And so it's not a full-time job for any one of them, and that's a real challenge for them, as well as for the federal government to get that assistance to that last mile, to those small jurisdictions that may only have a few people who are really dedicated to working on elections on a full-time basis.
Good. So, we've heard a lot about mail-in voting as one way to reduce the COVID-19 related risks. Wouldn't it just be a lot simpler if states just used all mail-in elections?
So I think one of the things that goes back to this point about how elections are run in the United States. So the Constitution really puts the onus for administrating elections on the states. And so each state has taken its own path on how they want to do that. There are some states that have already gone all the way to the point of establishing what's called universal vote by mail. There are 5 states that do that right now. The one with the longest experience is Oregon. There have been more recent examples with Hawaii, for example, that have transitioned to that. But that's been a very slow process over time. It's not just a question of logistics, which is important. How do you make sure that you're able to print the ballots, get the ballots out to the voters, ensure that the voters know how they can return them? Because vote by mail is somewhat of a misnomer. You can vote in terms of returning your ballot through the mail system, but you can also drop it off at a ballot drop-off box or at your local registrar's office. But there's also a question of just educating the public about how they go about doing this, making sure that they're registered, all those important steps that have to be taken into account. And that's not something that you can implement quickly or overnight, particularly in states that have very little experience of even absentee ballot. They may only have a few percentage of their voters who participate by absentee balloting, which means that they don't have the infrastructure in place to deal with a large influx of ballots in just a few weeks before Election Day.
So Jennifer, what does your research say about which voting methods are best and why?
Our research doesn't identify one specific way as the best way to conduct elections. Instead, what we really find is that states vary, and that's okay. States, their voting processes have evolved over time based on the resources that they have, who the leadership is, preferences in terms of tolerance for risk, how big jurisdictions are, and a whole range of different factors. And these processes and procedures have evolved over a long period of time. So for any given state, they're going to select those processes that fit best with all of those different factors. What's really most important in November of 2020 is making sure that states are able to allocate resources to the pieces of that infrastructure that are going to be most stressed, whether that's making sure they have sufficient sanitation and PPE at in-person voting places, or making sure that voter education is sufficient for mail-in voting, they have enough machines and people to process mail-in ballots, and a system set up to process those ballots when they come in. So it's really difficult to identify one way is better than another. They just have different challenges in the current context.
Well, your research, you considered how easily states could be able to adapt to the challenges of the pandemic. Do states that are considered to have greater flexibility share any characteristics? And then what about those states that have less flexibility?
Well, I think the states that we categorize as having more flexibility are those that are best able to shift their processes to remote and distributed processes. We were really focused on how prepared states were to manage the challenges specifically of the pandemic. And that comes down to largely the health risks. Those are the ones that are specific to the pandemic. And for states that are most well prepared to do this in terms of their processes and procedures are, first of all, states that have this ability to shift their processes to remote and distributed ones across many different dimensions. So they have it in registration, they have it in voting method, and they have it in terms of early voting. States that we categorize as more flexible tended to have online and automatic voter registration, which means just more ways for people to register, minimizing in-person contact. They have no excuse mail-in voting, so anybody can vote by mail, as well as they had deadlines that allow for mailing on Election Day as opposed to before it, so ballots could be received after Election Day as long as the postmark was on Election Day. And they didn't have notary or witness requirements, which again just adds interpersonal contact. And then in terms of early voting, they had long early voting periods so that more people could vote before Election Day. On the flip side, states that have less flexibility tended to be much more anchored to in-person processes. So in order to vote by absentee or by mail, you had to have a valid excuse. Registration tended to be in-person only, and much more limited in terms of early voting options.
Quentin, given all the news about the Postal Service slowdown or being overwhelmed, should people who want to vote by mail be worried their ballots won't count? Is there anything that voters can do to reduce this risk?
Sure, there's a lot that voters can do, and it's important to note that in some cases they'll already be receiving their absentee ballot right now in the mail, and we've already seen a few states start early voting. So you always have that option of being able to take that ballot that you receive and drop it off. But to take a step back, the first piece is if you want to vote absentee or vote by mail, you have to make sure that you're registered to do that. And many states will actually, and jurisdictions will have their website set up where you can check the status of your registration, so you can understand whether you were actually set up to do that. There are some interesting quirks of the system as you look at, for example, Pennsylvania is a unique state in that absentee balloting is ensconced in the Constitution, but they also, which requires an excuse, but they also have vote by mail, which doesn't require an excuse. And so they actually have those two that are playing together in one. You have 16 states that do require a valid excuse to get an absentee ballot. And in fact, the state Supreme Court in Texas has just recently ruled that the pandemic is not a reason that somebody can request an absentee ballot. So it really behooves voters to work early on to figure out what are the rules in their state and their jurisdiction for getting an absentee ballot and being able to vote by mail and get that. Don't wait till the end. Don't wait just because it says that they can request a ballot, for example, in some states a day before the election. It's highly unlikely if you wait that long that the processing will take place where you'll even get your ballot sent back to you in time. And that's not just a question of the Postal Service, that's also a question of those rules that are set in place by some states that really make it very tight time frames. So even if everything went perfectly well with the Postal Service, their delivery standards for first class mail are usually 2 to 3 days. So you have to keep that in mind. And then finally, you can always drop off your ballot. You don't necessarily have to return it by mail. You can drop it off in many places. There'll be drop boxes, they'll be available. You should be able to find out where those are through the websites that your elections officials have set up, or you can even go to a polling place in some cases and give your ballot to a poll worker in a polling place.
It's also worth noting that some states have changed their rules. So Arkansas, Massachusetts, Connecticut, they're all allowing absentee or no excuse mail-in voting for the 2020 election only. So it's worth checking, even if you've checked in the past, to see whether your state has modified its procedures, either in terms of the deadlines for the ballots, the way that you can receive them. So some states are mailing absentee ballots to all registered voters, or whether even the availability. So it's worth checking. And we, Quentin and I, developed a tool that you can look at online to see both, to see the traditional or existing legal requirements. And in the report we've listed, which is available on our website, we've listed a lot of the changes that have occurred.
So Quentin, I know you've spent a considerable amount of time focused on foreign influence and cyber threats within elections. How vulnerable is the election process to foreign influence or cyber threats, and could a determined group of hackers somehow challenge the outcome of the election?
Yeah, I think that's the big question everybody has, is to what extent are cyber threats and disinformation going to have an impact on the election this year? And certainly when you look at elections infrastructure, as we talked about earlier, it's so diffuse and it varies across jurisdictions and states. And in some cases, they will be quite vulnerable to cyber threats. But I think what tends to happen is people think that we're just talking about the voting machines and whether my vote when I cast on a voting machine is going to be manipulated in some way. And actually, that's probably the least likely, the lowest risk, in part because it's really hard to scale that kind of attack. And although people have demonstrated that there is a way in some cases to influence and change data on those machines, it really requires very close proximate access to those machines. More concerning are things like voter registration databases, because they are online databases that are often accessible remotely. And that is something that we know from past experience that, for example, the Russian cyber actors were trying to target in 2016. And so that could cause some havoc, not just in terms of creating confusion on election day. You can imagine showing up at your polling place and saying, I'm so-and-so, I'm here to vote, and you're not in the registration database. You're not in the poll book. And that could be because your information was changed. Now, in every state, you can cast a provisional ballot. So that's certainly something you can overcome, but it does create an additional administrative burden. Plus, quite frankly, it causes people to call into question the integrity of elections when things like that happen, that kind of confusion. Also, we just talked about websites being an important source of information about how to vote, where to vote, and so forth, but websites can also be vulnerable to hacking. And even if you can correct those issues quickly, identify them, it still causes confusion. Plus, you have all the other outlets that people are going to be trying to push information. We saw this example in Kentucky where there was a fake website for people to try to register that was out there. That's been subsequently taken offline, but still, that's a continuing concern. And then you have the much broader information and disinformation that will influence, I think, how people perceive the integrity of the elections, and particularly this year when it's so hotly contested at the national level, presidential level, but also when you think about Senate races, House races, and so forth. That's going to be, I think, a big concern for elections officials is how can they get the real word out there about what's happening, and particularly because when you think about the high expectation of a large volume of absentee ballots, we're not going to know the results of the elections on election night. And we've become attuned to thinking that that's where people are going to call the election on election night. And I think that's highly unlikely to be the case. Or people will want to call the election on election night, and we just won't know because there'll be this trail of absentee ballots that will be coming in, including, by the way, overseas voters like deployed military members who are also able to vote by mail, and people who are serving in the diplomatic corps, or just citizens who are based overseas who want to vote for president as well as other elections.
I think one important addition is when we think about disinformation, there's a lot of focus about disinformation about one candidate or about the other candidate. I think really the most damaging disinformation is, as Quentin said, disinformation about the election itself, about things that happened on election day or before election day, about how to vote, about the counting of ballots. That's really much more damaging. On the issue of candidates, most people have made up their minds on who they're going to vote for, and there's only a very small number of voters whose minds can still be changed. And we don't really know that online disinformation is all that effective at changing people's minds. There's a large portion of people who don't actually consume political news online, and so they aren't necessarily affected by that. They're much more strongly affected by friends and family and things like that. So when we think about the disinformation challenge, the type of disinformation that I think we should be most worried about is the type of disinformation that is undermining the legitimacy of the election or compromising people's ability to get to the polls at the right place at the right time, or vote by mail in the right way. I think that's much more of a danger than disinformation about one candidate or another candidate.
It's really concerning. So what are the best ways the federal government can help prepare the states to deal with the threat of a pandemic and counter cyber or any other threat that might come their way?
Yeah, I think there are several things that are already underway. We saw, for example, the Department of Homeland Security during the 2018 midterm elections. They set up what they termed a war room so that they could help state and local elections officials if things like disinformation were coming up, cybersecurity threats that they were detecting, so that they'd be able to quickly deploy resources to help them out. And they're going to expand that effort this year. I think that's really important. The other piece is that we've heard from state and local elections officials that when it comes to things like disinformation, they could really use help to identify when it's that happening. Is it just happening to me, or is it happening to other places? And can we get help to engage with, for example, social media platforms to really work expeditiously to try to remove that, or at least fact check those kinds of things? To be honest, as I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing early voting in a number of states, and so the ability to put in place other protective measures, is that window is rapidly closing if it hasn't already. And finally, I think one of the big things, going back to the concerns over the pandemic, is that people will want to vote in person either early or on election day. There's a challenge in a lot of states to be able to provide not just a safe working environment, and voting environment, but also making sure you have enough poll workers. Poll workers have traditionally skewed towards the elderly population. As we know, they tend to be at greater risk of suffering complications from COVID-19. And so you're seeing, for example, in the primaries, there are some cases where poll workers were no-shows or absentees or just didn't feel safe. And so there are a lot of elections officials who are trying to recruit from younger cohorts to bring them on board, working with companies and other organizations to provide the means to get poll workers. And that's not something where you can just show up on election day and say, I'm here to help out at the polls. You have to be trained to do it. You have to be trained to deal with all the contingencies that may arise, because the worst thing is you don't want somebody making up an answer if they don't know the answer on election days. So that if somebody is not in the poll book, for example, but they insist that they're registered, the poll worker needs to know how to deal with that. And also be trained, quite frankly, to deal with all the issues about ensuring social distancing at the polling places is put in place, that people are not standing in large groups for long periods of time, that poll workers themselves are also kept safe, not just the voting public.
Yeah, Quentin's right that the window is rapidly closing. There still is room for resources where they're available. So making sure that states have the resources they need to shore up and strengthen the infrastructure that they're going to rely on most heavily. That can mean extra pay for people who are willing to vote to work at the polls. Poll workers are typically paid a very small salary, so increasing that as a recruitment tool, or using those resources to purchase PPE or to increase training resources. There's going to be a whole host of additional challenges that poll workers face. Enforcing mask rules is probably one of the biggest ones we've seen in almost every industry, cases of people who don't want to wear masks, assaulting people who are asking them to wear masks. So how are you going to deal with that at a polling place? So there's a whole range of additional challenges. And there are places where it wouldn't be too late to invest more resources. So making sure that states have those resources is a final important way that the federal government can support the states. But even that we know we only have 6 weeks about until election day. So that even that window is closing.
Yeah, there's only so much time here. So you conducted a survey where you asked voters about their perceptions of the upcoming elections. What did you learn? Maybe Jennifer, you can start first.
Yeah, well, we asked them about their perceptions of safety, integrity, and how prepared local officials were. And in each case, we found that a majority said yes, they expected elections to be physically safe, that they expected their vote to be counted, and that they expected local officials to be prepared. We asked them in April and May, so this was a while ago. We asked them again in August, so we're analyzing that data to see whether they've updated their expectations. But while we found that a majority said yes, that they expected safety and integrity and preparedness, we found that there was also a significant amount of uncertainty. So about a third of respondents in each case said they weren't sure. And so that suggests that voters are still, at least at the April and May timeframe, we're still waiting to see how things evolved. Whether or not that uncertainty will decrease as we get closer to election day is something that we're going to be looking for in subsequent waves of our survey.
So how do attitudes or concerns differ for the various voter populations?
Well, we found that Republicans were much more likely to express concerns about integrity, about whether or not their vote would be counted correctly, given the challenges caused by the pandemic. But they were much less concerned about safety. And the opposite was true of respondents who identified as Democrats. So that was the first thing that we noticed in the data. Second, we found that older respondents tended to have higher expectations about safety and about integrity. So they were more likely to say yes, they expected elections to be safe and that they expected their vote to be counted correctly. The same was true of voters who have voted more recently. So we looked at respondents who said that they voted in either 2016 or 2018, and compared to voters who have lapsed, who haven't voted in a while, either by mail or in person. These recent voters were much more likely to have confidence in the election infrastructure, and that makes sense. They've been more engaged, they voted more recently, so they may be more comfortable overall. And finally, we found that Black respondents and Hispanic respondents were much more likely to express uncertainty about the integrity of elections, whether or not their vote would be counted correctly. That's a really interesting finding, and also one that makes sense if we think about the history of voter intimidation and suppression and enfranchisement in the United States.
So did any of your analysis suggest that turnout might be lower this year, or will it be higher?
We didn't find all that much change in turnout. When we compare voters over time, so we are able in the American Life Panel, which is a survey that RAND runs, to match respondents. So we can look at the same respondent at 2016 in the early summer period and 2020 in the early summer period. So we're comparing apples to apples, the same individual. We didn't find all that many people who expressed lower intention to vote. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the pandemic isn't having an effect. The pandemic could be reducing people's intention to vote at the same time as other factors are increasing it. So we'd see no change overall, even if there was a change on the margin. We did find a small number of voters who expressed some decline, suggesting that they were less certain to vote in 2020 than they had been at the same time in 2016. But these voters tended to have safety and preparedness concerns. So we do see that for some small group of voters, safety does seem to matter, but that on net, we're not seeing a huge change.
And did you learn anything about how voters plan to vote?
Yeah, we did see a shift towards vote by mail. That's not surprising given the current condition. We found about 12 to 13% of our respondents who had voted in person in the past, according to their self-report, who said they plan to vote by mail. That group of people tended to be self-identify as Democrats, to live in urban areas, to have safety concerns. So we see vote by mail being used as a way to mitigate those safety concerns, which again, isn't surprising. It'll be interesting to see how that shifts over time, whether given all the news in the past couple of months about slowdowns with the Postal Service, we see shifting backwards towards in-person voting. There was very little shift from mail to in-person in the last survey. But one thing that will be interesting to observe is whether that's changed now that we are getting closer and we have more information about possible challenges.
So we're so close to this election in November, and I'd like to hear from both of you. Maybe Quentin, we'll start with you, but given that we are just a few weeks away from the election, what can be done now to ensure safe and secure elections in November?
Well, I think there are several things that can still happen. Obviously, the elections officials have been drawing a lot of lessons learned, particularly in those states that their primaries happened after the pandemic really started to catch fire here in the United States in March. And that was a majority of states, learning those lessons about what worked and what didn't, and also understanding how it shifted potentially the dynamics of how people wanted to vote. We did see, for example, that there were in some cases a consolidation of voting centers, which carries with it the ability clearly to be able to support those, but then there's also the challenge that it may not provide equal access for certain populations. So that's a concern. So they've been looking at how they can expand the use, as Jennifer mentioned before, things like sports arenas, areas that are much more likely to allow you to spread out and provide more space to people. They won't be using places like retirement homes or even schools in some cases because of just the risks that are involved there. There's still work that can be done to bring in more protective equipment, as we mentioned before. And I think the major thing is that every voter included, just needs to educate themselves about, what are the processes in their jurisdiction. You can still, in some places, register to vote if you haven't yet. So that's still something to do, and that's something that you should do now. Don't wait until the day or two or a week before the election, and have a plan for that. Map it out kind of on the back of an envelope of how you're going to make sure that you're registered, that you have where you want to vote, and also be aware that in some cases there may be last minute changes that will happen, and that's going to be just a natural consequence of the uncertainty, where, for example, if poll workers show up and some of them are determined to actually have symptoms and they may need to be sent home, that may lead to a consolidation or shift in polling places. So people have to have some patience as well and recognize that, as we've seen, for example, with Virginia and early voting, there may be long lines, and that is going to be a challenge that we'll have to face.
Yeah, the last thing, I think Quentin covered most of them. The last thing I think that states can still do is think about communicating what they've done, both on the integrity and on the safety. So making sure that voters know, if you come to vote in person, here's what you will experience. There will be, here's how we're sanitizing. Here's the type of PPE that we'll be providing, just so that voters who are coming in person can have confidence that they will be safe and that precautions have been taken. And making sure that messaging starts now so that when voters are making their plan, as Quentin suggested, they can take into account all the different things that states have done. Right now, their expectations are formed based on what they think states will do. So any type of information that they have will be beneficial. And then we also saw that integrity matters. When we think about intention to vote, when we see lower intention to vote, those do tend to be people with safety concerns. But for some groups, integrity matters there too. So making sure that voters are aware of what they're doing to make sure that all the mail-in votes are counted and how they're going to verify. And what are the options for voters to check and see that their mail-in vote was received and counted? Different states have different procedures, and making sure that that information is readily available can increase voter confidence and ensure that anybody who wants to vote and who would have voted in the absence of the current pandemic will still be able to do so and feel confident about doing so.
Earlier in our call, we talked about analyzing the answers that you're getting now from your August questioning of your participants. What's next in this line of research at RAND? What can we expect to come out in the next few months?
Well, the first thing that we're going to do, as I said, was, we have an August wave of the survey. We're collecting an October wave, and we're going to do a post-election wave. So that will give us 4 data points that will allow us to really see how voter attitudes evolved from the May timeframe to October as the election got closer, and then also how things turned out. What do voters report about how they voted and whether they voted? We know that voters don't always remember correctly, and they don't always tell the truth, but we can still get a really great snapshot because we are able to track the same voter over that whole time frame. So we're not just doing cross sections of different people. And so that's the first. And then the second thing that we're planning to do is to try to do an assessment of what happened, to look at how states modified their voting procedures in the lead up to November, whether that's adding easier access to mail-in voting or changing deadlines, or any number of other modifications that have been made. What actually happened? How did practice differ from what they promised or what they intended to do? Where did things go wrong? Where did things go right? And trying to get a sense again of this variation that Quentin mentioned, the difference between small jurisdictions that maybe have fewer people and resources, and bigger urban districts where there were many more people and potentially many more resources as well. We're thinking about this in the near term right now in terms of what's going to happen in November, but a lot of the issues that we're talking about aren't specific to a pandemic, and even those that are may be relevant to other types of disruptions and disasters. It certainly isn't going to be the last time that an election is challenged by some kind of unexpected event. So there's likely a lot that we can learn from this time that will help us be better prepared for future elections.
Jennifer hit it on the head at the end there. One of the big things to think about is that so many people we're hopefully going to get past this pandemic soon. But whether this is a unique event or something that has insights that can also apply to thinking about planning for elections in the future, I think will be a major component of what we're trying to look at as we look at the election this fall and how it went. How well did states do? Because I think also there may be some broader implications and lessons learned for just overall elections administration in the United States. What does that look like going forward? The federal-state partnership, and then also the role of voters themselves.
Thank you, Jennifer and Quentin, and thank you all for joining us. We are grateful for your support, and we hope you will continue to use RAND as a resource for trusted information. I hope you'll join us on Tuesday, October 6th for our next RAND remote conversation on racial equity. Stay tuned for more RAND remote opportunities, and feel free to reach us at randremote@rand.org. Goodbye for now.
Fact. Fiction. Misinformation. Disinformation. Do you trust what you see on the news today? What you read online? What your friends and colleagues post on social media? Can you have open, constructive conversations about our global future with those who may have different views? If you answered no to these questions, you're not alone. Our society is suffering from truth decay. It's not new, but it has become widespread. Civil discourse has stalled. People have disengaged from their communities. Inaction and reaction plague the policymaking process on vital issues, from education and healthcare to energy and national security. If we don't have confidence in our sources of information, if we don't know how to find the facts, if we can't be respectful in our interactions with each other, our way of life is at stake. But we have a chance to fight back with facts. We have a responsibility to restore facts to their rightful place at the center of decision-making and the foundation of policymaking. Imagine a tomorrow where analysis, not opinion, is used to make decisions about our collective safety and security, health and well-being. Imagine a tomorrow where dialogue drowns out the voices that shout the loudest. The future of democracy depends on our action today. Can you imagine a better tomorrow? We can. Tomorrow demands today.